And that's exactly what happened with this piece, because the norm of entrepreneurship, especially in startups, is that you're dealing with failure or near failure. You're like constantly trying to thread the needle to live another day. And so you end up in these really difficult situations that almost never get shared. And so I was in this really unique opportunity, just like psychologically, whereas I was in a difficult situation, but it wasn't a bad situation of my own making. So I don't have any ego about just explaining the fix.
Hey there, I'm Larry Weeks. Welcome to the Bounce Podcast. My guest today on the podcast is Tony Stubblebine. Tony is the CEO of Medium. He's also the co-founder and former CEO of Coach.me. And he spent a career in the intersection of technology, behavior change, and digital community. And before stepping in as Medium CEO, Tony was already a major force on the platform, running some of its largest publications, including Better Humans. And I knew of Tony through Medium before he became CEO, through his writings, and through his programs on Coach.me, which were phenomenal. And I remember the announcement when he took the job, and I thought to myself, well, perfect. But I, like probably everybody else, had no idea what was happening at the time until his recent post hit my inbox just last week. The post, which I encourage all of you to read, is titled, Fell into Hole and Got Out. It's a great title, but it's a write-up of what happened at Medium. And the article is one of the most candid, insightful, and somehow he makes it succinct stories I've read about what happens inside a company on the brink and what it takes to pull it back. So I immediately reached out to Tony's team to see if he would come on the show and talk about it, and I'm very grateful he did. This is a peek inside of what it's actually like to take over a company, losing millions a month, hemorrhaging users, and facing potential shutdown, and the strategic and psychological work required to turn it all around. So on the show, Tony shares how he and his team built a ladder out of this hole, balancing brutal financial realities along with the challenges of restoring quality and purpose to the platform. So we talk negotiations, we get into a little bit, not too much governance and recaps, cutting costs. We get into the human side of letting people go, along with some great advice on hiring Tony gives. We discuss why Tony now thinks the business model comes before product, and he gives some great big picture advice for entrepreneurs. And then we get into his personal practices that kept him sane through all of this shit show. So some great advice here. But it's also, when you listen to Tony, you have an example of what a thoughtful leader is. And it's also proof that you can be a good human and make very tough decisions and do very hard things. So without further ado, here's Tony. Tony, how you doing?
Good. Do I sound okay? Do I look okay? My head's, I can match your head size if you want.
I'm too ugly to get that close, that's for sure.
Can I tell you the funniest thing I learned? There's a group of people that I worked with at one point who I never met in person. It took me a long time before I met them in person. And they told me I had more charisma in person. And I was like, what are you talking about? And it turned out that I was sitting so far away from the screen that my head looked small, and they were reading that as low gravitas. And so it's in our new era, a big head on Zoom is the executive power move. The thing that cracked me up is that it had never occurred to me that having the biggest head on screen is a Zoom power move.
I'm going to start zooming in, start revealing my pores, I guess. Wow, that's some behavioral psychology right out of the gate, Tony.
Right out of the gate.
Boom.
So I love it.
I had James Altucher on some years back, and I told him I hated editing stuff. He said, Larry, you should leave as much of this stuff. I said, what are you talking about? He said, this is early on. He said, people love the humanity or the,
Totally.
He said, it's a fly on the wall kind of a thing where you're behind the curtain. You know,
I was early in the development of podcasts. I had worked for the startup Odeo, which is what Twitter spun out of. But originally we wanted to do podcasting. And so we were looking at what we thought kind of two examples of great podcasts was one, this old MTV VJ, Adam Curry, got into podcasting, started referring to himself as the pod father. And every podcast he did was incredibly well produced because he came from media. He knew how to do that. But the podcast that blew all of our minds, because we were startups and we didn't know how startups work, were these two venture capitalists, Venture Voice, who would record the podcast driving in their car down 280 with like traffic noise going on. And it was the opposite of well produced. And it's exactly what James Altucher is telling you about. Like, yeah, it's actually to be the fly on the wall of something interesting, which fingers crossed we're going to do today, is really special, even if it's not perfectly produced.
Yeah. People love you for your vulnerabilities. Maybe that's writ large, in these kind of conversations.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
You got to deal with my voice. I mean, I've got a face for radio and a voice for writing, and that's how I ended up the CEO of a writing company. So we're going to do our best. The material.
Your voice is fine. Coming at you, Z107. We are a lot. So, man, what a great article. Thank you for coming on to discuss it. You got to be getting some great feedback here.
What I told my team is like, I wish I had a nose for what would resonate with the mainstream, but instead I have a nose for what's going to resonate with other entrepreneurs. And I was like, that's exactly what happened with this piece, because the norm of entrepreneurship, especially in startups, is that you're dealing with failure or near failure. You're like constantly trying to thread the needle to live another day. And so you end up in these really difficult situations that almost never get shared. And so I was in this really unique opportunity, just like psychologically, whereas I was in a difficult situation, but it wasn't a bad situation of my own making. So I don't have any ego about just explaining the fix, right? Because I don't have to be like apologetic about all the problems that I created. I just signed up. There was problems, matter of fact about it. I signed up to fix them. And so something that happens relatively frequently is a startup gets into a really bad spot and needs to get its way out. One of the ways to do that is to go restructure your deal with your investors. And it turns out there's a way to do it. And I didn't know that going in, but I learned it. The Medium ethos is if something interesting happens to you, you should write it up and share it.
So for the audience, real quick, I want to put everybody to read this. Don't care if you're founder, employee, what have you. Fell in a hole, got out. It's Medium's recap, financial turnaround, and you wrote about the difficult path to health. I just wanted to say it was great because you give a high overview of the challenges, strategy, and the outcome I'm going to talk about, and ultimately happy ending. Okay. But when I talk to you, the goal here is I want to get both the mechanics, strategy, but also the psychology, the real world, what you did and some of the psychology around it to glean as many lessons as we can for the listeners. So my default reading of it was the turnaround side. Okay, here's how bad I read it, but my default was really focused on what you did to turn it around. But there's a huge benefit, Tony, to describing the whole, which you did very well, because you could flag, like you said earlier, you could kind of flag the founders in startups. There's so many of them about the holes to avoid, number one, digging, or, you set some traffic cones around and say, hey, look for these things. I'm assuming you just wrote from your heart, but did you have this in mind? I'm writing this for the next guy like me.
Yeah. I mean, one of the really special parts of the story, because it's so meta about Medium itself, is it's a Medium blog post that spelled out the recipe that I used. And so here's this VC in 2013 wrote out kind of the key observation about how to get it done in the situation we were in. Because there's sort of a default way to do a recap, and then there's some secondary and third way. So I knew we couldn't do the default way. The default way is, essentially your existing investors have gotten tired of you, don't want to support you anymore. You find a new investor and you say, I'll give you whatever terms you want, because if you don't give me money, the company's going to shut down. And so that new investor comes in and says to all the other investors, I'm willing to fund this company, but only if I get a massive payday from it. So either participate on my terms or this company is going to shut down and you get a zero. And that's essentially the whole leverage of these. It's essentially the startup version of bankruptcy. It's the same kind of concept here. You want to keep going, but you can't given your current financial structure. So normally that's driven by an outside investor who just sort of calls their own shot because no one else is willing to put up any money at all. But we didn't have an outside investor because we were doing this at a time when the whole startup market froze. There had been a lot of money sloshing around because we had low interest rates, and then interest rates went up and the money just froze for almost an entire year. The winter, which I think started in the summer of 22, is
this month it started. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, to the point that the VCs were sending out memos to their companies saying, like, whatever money you have, just plan on it being the last money you ever have. Start doing layoffs. Like, they were like, that was advice that was coming across the entire industry.
I want to storyboard this. I want to back up because I've got a whole thing about recaps, which is fascinating. And I know that was a large part of the turnaround, but there was so much shit that had hit the fan. So let's back up. You
Sure.
were, if you don't mind, because I
Okay.
just want you to tell the story. I knew you from Coach.me. Let me just say, I just loved it. I was like, this thing helped
Amazing.
me. I've read you forever. I remember you wrote something about an iPhone thing. I loved your stuff. Now, you were also a big part of Better Humans, which is kind of a Medium publication. Did Ev reach out to you?
I think the first thing you need to know about me is that if you put a text box in front of me, I'm going to fill it out. And like, I just love user generated content on the internet. And so I have this history with Medium. So we'll say, first of all, Medium is founded by this guy, Evan Williams, who founded Blogger and then Twitter and then Medium. This is a guy that's done like the most of anyone in the entire internet to make user generated content. This ability for anyone to just speak up on the internet and share their voice. I think it's done more than anyone ever in that regard. And I had this opportunity to work with him back in 2005. I'd worked for the startup that he was working on in between Blogger and Twitter. And it was about podcasting. It didn't really work, but we built the first version of Twitter together and spun it out. And I didn't see why I should go with that. So I went somewhere else. But we know of each other. And I always go.
Yeah, there's a relationship there, guy. Okay.
I always go out of my way to say that we're not friends because we're not friends. Like I don't think he knows my dog's name, which I like. All of my friends know my dog. My dog is lovely and very friendly, but we really like working with each other. And Silicon Valley is a relationship business because it's so like, you have chemistry together. And so what had happened when he left Twitter and started Medium is at the same time I was starting another company and he helped me start it. He was on my board. He helped me actually design the first versions of it. What you call Coach.me started out as this habit tracker called Lyft. And our offices were often co-located with Medium. What happened for me is I loved the business that I was building, but I also just love writing on the internet. And I had just fallen in love with Medium as a product. And it's where I blogged. It's where my company blogged. It's where I created a community of coaches who were writing. And then I grew that to be something bigger, actually a huge productivity and self-improvement publication called Better Humans. And I demonstrated what I thought Medium should be, is like, there's something incredibly valuable about giving a voice to everyone because there's value in our life experiences. And there's something especially valuable about getting professionals to talk about their work. So we were doing that in Better Humans. And as Medium, they started looking for external partners. And so I just started doing partnerships with them because I liked Medium so much. By the time he was ready to step down, I was by far Medium's biggest power user. I have this long 15-year background as a CEO, but also very notably, something like 2% of Medium's traffic was going to a publication that I owned or to my own writing.
So you were a perfect fit in that regard. Yeah.
In that regard, I think there's something I had never gotten my own companies to be particularly successful. So I felt like I had mastered a lot of the nuts and bolts of running a company, but it was enough to be a plausible candidate for this. And it turns out that a turnaround is actually a lot about knowing the nuts and bolts about what matters and what doesn't, like what contributes to the bottom line and what doesn't.
Yeah. And you had, I think, glad you pointed it out, one of your superpowers you say was, and it makes sense, you wore many hats as with these smaller scale-wise startups. You had done it all and took pride in they were profitable. So were you privy then before they tapped you or as they were about to tap you? I'm assuming the hole was already dug. Were you privy to that hole before you took?
I mean, extremely privy. I'd say like my application process was 4 years long. Me in the background going, Ev, don't do it that way. Do it my way. And then my way turning out to be fairly successful. And so I had just this history of, I think we should go in this direction and here's why. And then it kept panning out that I had a good sense of it. So the history of Medium is like, here you've got this guy who's this luminary in publishing online. And he starts this company, Medium, which right away makes this huge name for itself on design. Like a lot of times when we think about product development, we think about, oh, we need to invent new features or add a lot of features. And Medium just proved you could take every feature that was expected of a blogging platform. And instead of adding more, you could actually take a lot of them away and just make the ones you kept like incredibly beautiful. Like Medium found the essence of what mattered for writing online. And it's like for that version of Medium, simplicity was power. And suddenly you don't have to like create your own WordPress. You don't have to install software. You don't have to even set up a blog or do all of this configuration. You can just start writing. And really, it was almost felt innovative at just a pure design level. And then the second big innovation was the hardware. That's the one where we fell into a hole, which is very rightfully put his finger on everything that he doesn't like about the internet, and which most of us don't like about the internet, is the root cause is the business model. If your business model is ads, then all of your incentives are attention, and attention is the root cause of why we get divisiveness, like misinformation, like it just, like all of this
Clickbait. Yeah.
clickbait, all of that stuff. It's because the incentives are to grab your attention, not to deliver value for your attention. It's actually, if the article is too engrossing and you don't notice the ads, then you've done a disservice to the advertiser, right?
And I don't remember, before your CEO, was that the model? It was both.
They tried ads, backed out of it. And so before I got there, so the two innovations of from Av are first the design, and then to make a bundled subscription. So it's one price. You don't have to subscribe to individual people. One price for everything on Medium, and let the writers participate. And so rather than go build an audience and build a subscriber base, it's like, oh, maybe I only have one thing to say, but I can publish it into the subscription and get a share based on who reads it. So no one's ever put a bundled subscription on top of a social media platform. Every prior social media platform was advertising based. And so it turned out that this just like created for the company I'd call it a Goldilocks problem. It's like, okay, now that we've done this, how do we do it right? And so they tried it one way, it was very expensive, did not work. Tried it another way, was also fairly expensive, but also was like even worse because the quality was lower. And I was like kind of, as both of those paths were happening, I was making the case for this middle way of like, here's where I think the commercially valuable piece of UGC really lives. And if we can deliver on that, then we can have a business. But along that way, that sort of fall into a hole. Like a lot of things went wrong, and like a lot of expensive experiments did not work. I think also I would say it's really hard to innovate with a middle stage company.
Somebody said, don't be a hero. Look, you're going to take this role. Don't be a hero. And then I kind of parsed out, because I'm kind of slow, but I parsed out that I think it meant, and I think what you say in the article is, don't try to invent your way out of an issue or innovate. I mean, your job is to make this thing profitable, okay? Don't come in and try to add a bunch of stuff or invent a bunch of stuff or innovate your way out of this.
There's a piece of it of understanding, like you're trying to do something heroic almost by definition, because business is hard. And even in good conditions, you're likely to fail. And despite that, it's worth knowing what the boundaries of possibility are. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs, and actually entrepreneurship in the US is sort of set up, there's no real downside to failure unless you put your own money up. Like in the startup ecosystem, you can start a company, raise money and fail and just go get your next job. So because of that, a lot of entrepreneurs are just like, I'll figure it out. And a friend of mine said that actually might be the right psychology. Just if you're the one flying the plane, fly it as fast as possible until you either reach altitude or crash into the ground. Like you want to hit the ground at full speed. But I think in this case, the advice I got was there are actual limits to what you're going to be able to do. This is the advice I got from the venture capitalists who had written the blog post that prompted me to understand I could kind of figure out the investor side of the turnaround. And that was almost his most important point, which is the psychology of an entrepreneur is that you can invent your way out of anything. And you have to come to grips. There's something here that you cannot fix. And that's the precursor to being able to go in to the investors and say, if you don't renegotiate your terms, it's not worth me coming into work tomorrow. And that's the leverage that sort of kicks off the recap part of the turnaround.
You take the job. Did you have was the turnaround plan kind of emergent as you got deeper and deeper in the weeds? Or did you have some semblance of a plan?
I had a very detailed plan on the financial and product turnaround. Like I was so close to Medium and I had so much experience with, where to spend money to make money, and I've started 2 companies. They weren't big successes, but I always thought it was important to if you start a business, it should be a business. And so both of them did get to be profitable. And so like, that's my wiring as a CEO. That is somewhat rare in the world of startups, actually. So that part, I was like, okay, we're going to do these things. I have about this much wiggle room. I'm going to have to cut these costs. Like roughly I knew, and we're going to have to invent some product changes, but I already know what those are. It actually wasn't until the day before I started that an investor friend of mine took me for a walk and we talked the plan out. And he believed that the business plan was plausible, but he pointed out to me all of the problems in the ownership structures. So the recap, there's 3 sides to the turnaround we did. One was product, one was financial, just making the revenue and the cost structure.
Just for the audience, it was basically insolvent at this point, right? It was just bleeding money, bleeding cash. So you really had to get this thing to profitability. And a lot of that is cost structures. For everybody listening who's not in the business world, a cap table is, and Tony, if you have an analogy, but
I'll do my
like
best.
a slice of the pie, like a slice of the pie of ownership. So it keeps the number of seats of people who own a piece of the company, something like that, right? And that stood out to me was the investors had pretty much given up. They knew the state of the business. So they were like, you're not going to get any more money from us.
It's like, you asked me what it was like to write this piece, and it's like, there's just a lot to talk about. So we'll say, like,
by the way, kudos for putting it in a condensed article because it was helpful for me. But now as we get into it, I'm like, oh, wow, there's
kudos
one
to Kurt,
side to another.
Kudos to Kurt Vonnegut, who was like, oh, this is how to simplify the structure. We fell into a hole, then we got out. But the easiest part of the hole to understand is just the business, right? Like we were losing $2.5 million a month. We only had limited money in our bank account. And our business was shrinking, not growing. If we did nothing, eventually we'd run out of money and go bankrupt. That was pretty easy to understand. And so we needed to pivot to a product, which for us is, putting the valuable content front and center. We had to make that pivot in a way that we could grow subscribers and cut some costs along the way. That's how you make a working business. And there's if you've ever played like a lemonade stand game, it's not that different than that. It's like, you need a product people want, you need to advertise it, you need to sell the product for more than it costs to make. That's business. The part that I did not understand was all of the complications of 10 years of investors. So I didn't understand till the day I started what got pointed out to me by this walk and with my friend Ross, who's a venture capitalist, is it would not work unless I eventually renegotiated with all the investors. And that filled me with such dread because I don't like difficult negotiations.
You were also, the governance was, you were kind of not the boss. You pointed out that to make a decision, votes had to happen and you didn't have time to play around.
So let's walk through the problems with kind of honoring your existing investor agreements. You take in money with certain terms, and in a good situation, everyone's happy. Everyone makes money. But there are these edge cases you get into where you can't find anyone to come to work, to do the work to allow you to honor these terms. And so it does force a renegotiation.
Employees take a backseat to a degree that was going to make this whole thing impossible.
Right. So you have this thing called a liquidation preference, which means that the investors get their money out first. But if the value of the company drops below the liquidation preference, then it tells the employees that we're going to pay you in equity, but your equity won't have any value until you've spent 2 or 3 years paying back the investors. And the employees think, well, why would I spend 2 years. If I might come to work tomorrow, I want to get I want to be in the money. I want to be compensated tomorrow. You said about the governance structure we have for a big decision. I would need to go back to our investors and get the majority approval of 5 different tranches of investors. And the thing is, at some point, the way venture capital works is they have this chunk of money that they're trying to manage for about 10 years. And once you get out of that 10-year period, they try to close their fund down. And one of the ways that they close it down is if there's any scraps remaining, they'll just sell those off to these scrap collectors, which are like the bottom feeders of private equity. And so I was in that moment where the investors had moved on, weren't thinking about us, but we know them. Silicon Valley is a relationship business. They're basically we can trust how they will act. If you look a year or two down the road, they're going to sell all of that stuff off to new investors who we don't understand, who we don't trust. And so approval is going to be 5 tranches of unknown strangers who are, essentially sharks. And that actually really tipped it over for me. That doesn't sound like a fun job. And so what Ross is pointing out to me is, let's say I start to turn the business around, and then I get into a moment where, I want to go big. Because that's why I did all this work. I think what Medium is now is just like scratching the surface. I think the point of Medium is to help like 1 billion people write. Like, we're in the business of helping people write and share their stories, right? Share their experiences. There's so much I want to do with this business, but let's say I want to do that. And now I have to get the approval of this whole complicated group of investors. And so Ross was making the case that you might succeed on the business side and then find you get just like sabotaged behind the scenes because of this investor structure. And then like kind of the thing that really tipped it over is not only did we have all of these owners, these investors that were owned a huge chunk of the company and this huge liquidation preference, we also had a bunch of loans that were about to come due, and then they came due. And the amount of the loans was way more than the amount of money that we had in the bank account. And that is insolvency. And so there's this opportunity when they do come due to have a discussion like, hey, we can't pay the whole thing back. Here are 2 options. And one of the options is like basically you get nothing, or we think we can give you a lot of equity. And so we use these debt holders as eventually the part of the leverage to go to all the investors and say, let's just restructure all of this and get healthy. We need to put a healthy investment structure in front of both management, myself and the team, because if we don't come to work tomorrow, that's a zero, and in front of these debt holders. And that's what we did. That's what essentially that's what a recap is. And I think if you're not in the world of startups, this is like, just think of it as a bankruptcy where you renegotiate with all your creditors. It's an improvement on their position, right? It's like on paper, they have a $235 million liquidation preference, but in practice, the business is worth $0. So that thing that they have on paper is worthless. And so whatever you renegotiate to, even though it's much worse than what they have on paper, it is definitely better than what they have in practice. And that's just it's a hard conversation because you have to be really honest about how bad things are.
Again, we're talking about profitability. You reduce the employee count fairly dramatically. Was it 200 down to 77 something?
Wasn't all me, but I did play a role in it. At our peak, we were 250 people. And At our low, we were 72. We're about 77 right now.
Did some of that happen under your purview?
Absolutely.
Okay. So there are people that have to make these decisions, and I've done it. Other people, it's, what is your take? What did you learn?
I always try to tread really lightly here because it's such a serious topic for people, because it's so financially damaging and just like, it's tough on your ego to lose your job out of the blue. It's scary. And as a result, people get really mad about it in the best case scenario. And then if you look at it as an industry, sometimes it seems like these layoffs are being done in a really cavalier, uncaring way. And that just is even more infuriating. So the baseline anger in the public is rightfully very high. I think the public discourse, from my perspective, seems to put a lot of blame on the moment of the layoff. I'll say personally, I feel a lot of pressure on the things that happened before the layoff. Who did you hire? How strong was your plan on how to make money off of hiring them? And how good were your expectations? Because in some industries, it's actually completely valid to say, I'm going to hire you to for the startup that might fail. So you also might lose your job. And if you set those expectations, then I think you've behaved with integrity. So for me, I feel this incredible pressure every time I hire that I just to be
Yeah, be
really, really
careful on the
clear,
hire side. Yeah.
I need to have a plan for making sure that this person that I'm taking a lot of their time, that's taking a risk on the business, that it's likely to work out. Coming into when it comes to the moment that you have to do the layoff, especially a medium's layoff, that just feels like the responsible thing to do because either you do this layoff or this partial layoff of the company, or you
Or
lay off
everybody, the whole business goes away. Yeah.
business, right? And for me, that's not that hard of a decision, especially
Yeah.
because again, I'm not digging, I'm getting us out of the hole, I didn't
Yeah.
create
Yeah.
this hole in particular. But it's still not easy because the startup economy got really bad. So I had this whole career where basically anytime I let someone go, either because
They were going to land somewhere. Yeah.
not just land, they'd get huge raises. I felt bad for not letting them go 6 months earlier. Not true anymore. I think right now, when you let someone go, it's plausible that they're not going to work for a while. So it just makes the decision making more serious.
Were the employees so tuned in that they knew, the ship was sinking? Or if they didn't, did you have a general conversation with them to say, hey, this is where we are. Let's have a heart to heart. Did that ever take place? Or were you too busy running with your hair on fire?
I have no hair. I do have a beard.
Well, it was on fire. That's why you don't have. Go ahead.
I would be curious to interview the company for someone else too, because I'm not sure I would get the perfectly honest answer. I think probably it was less clear than it should have been. And for a couple of reasons is I think the prior administration did a really good job of compensating people. It's like we're paid 90th percentile. We pay always at least 3 months severance, sometimes 6 months severance. That part of it was always fairly good, but I don't think we did a good job of expectation setting. And so what people came to believe is, oh, this company isn't really working, but we're not going to lose our jobs. And so the thing to kind of know about a turnaround is, by definition, a lot of bad things happened before the new CEO gets there. So I think what is the real reaction is I show up and everyone's been trained to think I'm probably the next mistake. And so when I come in and say, here's what I'm here to do, even though I think it's very logical that, hey, we're going to take this company from not profitable to profitable, we've been told other things that didn't pan out. I think that's kind of the reaction. A big part of the turnaround is figuring out who is naturally aligned with you and who can you win over and how can you help build the organization's confidence in my way of thinking. So I definitely didn't show up to a company that was we're dying to do the work of becoming profitable. We had to convince people of that, and not just convince them that it was a logical thing to do, but we were seriously going to do it. We weren't going to pivot to a new thing. It's the long-term focus. People don't necessarily believe that a leader has that long-term focus on day one, and you have to show that through your actions, and that takes a little bit of time.
So maybe they were suspect that didn't know how long you hang around or what have you. So then in your mind,
I'm
maybe,
sure they were suspicious.
Plus, you don't have that much authority, so you don't have that much time behind you there. In that particular role, what you're going to say going to make any difference? Well, in hindsight, would you, in this particular what we're talking about right now, would you have done anything different in that regard? Or, it turned out fine, so maybe not.
I'm wired to always be second guessing. I think that the kind of scenario planning is, you have to be doing that. That's how you grow as a leader. So if it took us 24 months to get to our first profit, or 25 months to get to our first profitable month, there'll always be a part of me that's wondering, could I have done it in 15? And I think it's very rare to cut costs and innovate at the same time. Those are hard to do in parallel because essentially once you start cutting costs, like people's ability to do new things really make it short circuit. So by definition, we have to pat ourselves on the back. It was like, that's hard, rare work. Business is hard, yada, yada. But also once you've done it, then you could do it again and do it faster. And so I just think it's a matter of like being more clear, being more direct, making decisions faster, spotting who's not aligned sooner and either getting them aligned or getting them out of the organization, like getting the right people in and just like going faster. I do think that was possible, but roughly like there weren't shortcuts that we missed as far as I can tell. I mean, we just had to do the work.
As we kind of wind down here, Tony, I want to bubble up anything from a lesson standpoint now that you've reflected on the experience. And obviously this is ongoing, but I was thinking of this, I don't know if you ever, there's this TV show, financial show, Marcus Lemonis, The Prophet. He would go in, it was a documentary kind of show. He'd go into a store. Now this is physical stores and turn them around, right? And obviously these are different animals than what you're dealing with, but he had like a 3P thing, it's people, process, and product. These heuristics are helpful to a degree, right? But they're not applicable everywhere. The only thing I'm reading as I'm looking at things is profit, product. But is there anything like that you can surface for us? And obviously, that's a terrible question because every situation is going to be different. So let me make this question open-ended. Give me some of the lessons or any heuristics, anything that now that you reflected on that you think might be helpful for somebody that's not necessarily called out, although maybe lightly touched on in the article.
If I was on the speaker circuit, I would boil all of this down. But it's also that it was 1,000 decisions. The metaphor we use inside the company is a ladder. We'll say we're building a ladder to the moon. And during a lot of the turnaround, we said every step on the ladder is $10,000 a month recurring. And it doesn't matter if it's growth or cost savings. Either one is fine, right? And so that sort of, I think that it's not just like give people a sense of purpose, but help them understand what does success look like. You kind of have to retrain people for your view of success. I think there's this entrepreneurship lessons, less about the turnaround and more about my own journey as an entrepreneur, which is when I started, I thought, you build a great product and people will come. That's sort of better mousetrap, right? And that's because I was in the product building side of a business and I really wanted to master it. And I thought it would be really fun to build something cool. And then I came to understand it's actually, if you want to, it's not that hard to build a great product. It's a lot of work, but it's not impossible work. Like once you've kind of mastered the craft. So I actually have a lot of confidence that if you put the time in, if you have a good group of people around you, you can build a product. What I've gotten burned on over and over again is having to abandon building a great product because the business and distribution didn't work. And so like I sort of flipped from thinking product first to thinking business model first. I still run into a lot of entrepreneurs who will come up to me and say, oh, I want to talk to you about this new habit tracking thing. And I always say to them, I'm sure you're going to build something that's useful. I don't even want to talk to you about it. But that's always the thing that they want to talk to me about. That doesn't matter because you're going to build something useful and no one will use it. Or people will use it and it's going to cost you a lot of money because no one will pay for it. So can we instead talk about how are you going to find your customers? How are you going to make money off of it? Because if you don't do those two things, you're going to throw your product away. But if you do that, you end up setting the framework that you're working within. And so the number one thing that I understood on day one, because I'm so lucky to have kind of grown up on this platform and didn't have to come in and do a lot of research on day one, was these are the parameters that make it work. Like these are the type of writers that exist out in the world that are not served, that also work as a business for Medium. We're going to go after them. We're going to redesign everything we do so that they succeed here in a way that they don't succeed in it. Like Medium is for all writing, but the writing that makes money for the writers and for us is people talking about their work. Like people that are too busy to build a mailing list that just want to come in and say like, here's a lesson I learned. So I knew that. And like, these are the parameters. And I was like, and here's how we get our customers. And just having those parameters, that was maybe 80% of the financial turnaround. But unlike a lot of entrepreneurs, I've bootstrapped a company without any investment. And as a result, like I'm very, very sensitive to the value of the dollar. Because in a lot of my experience, every dollar I pay out is coming out of my own pocket. And I think that sensitivity is really worthwhile.
Of ownership.
Yeah,
Like,
right.
it's me. I'm the company. This is my wallet.
Yeah. But I don't
Yeah.
think that equity gives the sense of ownership that people think it does. I think,
Yeah, it may take away. It may take
Yeah.
away.
that
Well, hell,
I-
it actually can and
Yeah.
does, and it chops it up in pieces. I come back to Coach.me and the habit tracker, because it's been a while since I've actually used it. But I remember I was struggling with some things, and having these practices
Yeah.
and your email every day, it was
Yeah.
really great saying, okay, meditate. We're going to track what we do. We're going to organize. Did that come back to serve you through this? And if so, was there any practice that kind of kept you from going insane here? Or were you just so excited to take on to
I'm glad you
eat the
asked.
whale that, you know what I mean? I don't know. But there had to
Was
be
it so much
freaking
fun?
stress.
A lot of difficult conversations. It was intellectually interesting. I'm glad we got here because there's a case I always like to make to people is like, give yourself permission to take a long time. Like, yes, there is such a thing as a 22-year-old entrepreneur, but there's also such a thing, and the data bears this out, of a middle-aged, like I'm 47, I think. And it took me a while to be okay at my job. It did. It just took me a while. And a lot of things that I'm good at now, it took me a while. And I think if you are really in a career because you love it, it's okay if it takes you a while to get great at it. Don't mortgage your house, right? Like, don't mortgage your entire future for it, but you can kind of design a life where it takes you a while. So you're asking, like, how did my experience, like 10 years running a habit tracking company that became this really broad universe of self-improvement, publishing and coaching, and like, we invented new models of coaching, and we had a whole coaching directory that we were running, and also this big publication on better humans. Like, no one was more steeped in all of the forms of self-improvement than I was, like from the woo-woo to the really, scientific.
Yeah.
I had like seen all.
That's what I'm asking. Yeah. You had a treasure chest of tools and tips.
Right. And so, like, in a way, again, maybe I was that company's biggest power user because it helped me maybe more than our customers. So the thing that helped me the most is that when it came time to interview for this job, I basically liked myself. And I think that's like, I never made that a goal. But when you're early in your career and you're in a high stakes conversation, you're really kind of wrapped up in whether the other person is going to validate you. And so there was this one moment, especially in a job interview. So there was this one moment where I was interviewing for the job, and one of the board members at the time was interviewing me. This guy is like a luminary of luminaries. He's like maybe one of the top 5 most famous venture capitalists right now, kind of an aggressive guy. And we're in the middle of the conversation, and he says to me, Tony, what big new idea do you have to save this company? And I think if I had been in a people-pleasing mode where I really needed his approval, I would have given him an answer I would have gone with the question. But at the moment, I was so just sort of stable with who I am. If I get this job, great. If I don't get this job, I'll do something else. I was able to very calmly reject the premise of the question. I said, his name was Ben. I said, Ben, I think that question is everything that's wrong with this company. That was my response. This is a job interview, right? I said, what this company needs to do is just focus on the thing that it's supposed to be doing and stop getting distracted by new ideas, big ideas, pivots. All of that stuff has to go out the window.
Don't be a hero. Yeah.
Just do this thing. You'll come out not just with a profitable business, but with something that you can really grow so much bigger than it is today. And to me, it stood out that I wasn't anxious about contradicting. And I would have been anxious 10 years earlier. And so, well, what is that journey? It was meditation, it was journaling, it was therapy. And did it take 10 years of those things? Absolutely. Eventually, I just came out of the other end of this self work feeling like comfortable, like this is, I don't think I'm the greatest, I don't say I like myself in that I'm like the greatest person of all time. I just I am who I am. And the strengths and weaknesses don't get me tripped up anymore in the way that they would have in my 20s, especially. So, yeah, in that way, the tools of self improvement, even though they're often sold to you as quick wins, if you embrace them as long term life practices, are really, really powerful. Brain plasticity is not quick, but
Tony, you sounded like you were centered and comfortable in your own skin. And people can pick up on, if you're not comfortable with yourself, projects, right?
yeah.
You're advocating for yourself and you believe in it. So, and I also like the fact that self-improvement or meditation or these kind of practices you make your bed before you have to lay in it. You don't pick these up as soon as the emergency or the shit hits the fan and expect everything to work out. You've got to prepare for the shit down the road now when everything's not burning down, that kind of thing, which you did. That's great. All these things, I was real curious as I was reading, were they done in parallel or sequentially? And does that even matter? Was there a domino that needed to fall first and then the other would come?
Yeah.
Now I'm back to the mechanic.
If there's three, I'll give a quick answer and then I'll give you this theme that I think is really important. We went product, financials, investors. There's some in parallel work, but essentially you can't say you fix your financials unless if you're selling the wrong product. So you have to be in the neighborhood of this is the product I want to be selling. Fully fix the financials until you've also fixed the product. And then there's also on day one, there was no point in restructuring with the investors because there was not enough plausible upside. So there's almost this sweet spot where the management team wants to continue, but also it's not sweet enough that the investors could bring in a new management team. And that's the moment where you can make the case, hey, let's do a restructuring here. You've got a good team, a good motivated team, and they don't have the incentives to keep going. Plus now we have this overdue debt and whatnot. So that all sort of came as we were wrapping up the financial turnaround and we did most of the product work pretty early. Can I say this thing that I think is so important? Because we live in a world where people are trying to grab attention by having the biggest and boldest opinion. And I want to say this thing that I think is much more important than that, which is that each of us have these incredible experiences just by living our lives. And we learn these lessons that we can share with other people. And to me, the essence of blogging online is that the lesson that you learned is wisdom that you can pass on to another person. And when we do this at scale, that's when I think we're achieving the best of the internet, when it's millions of people doing that. But this thing happened that was completely expected from my perspective. 2 days later, and a CEO reached out to me and said, I've got $16 million in revenue, but we got hit hard in this one thing. I'm in a difficult position. I think what you wrote about is what I need to do. I've got $16 million in revenue. This is a real company, but we got hit really hard. And I don't know how to work my way out of it without a hard conversation with our investors. And so 5 days after posting this piece, I'm on the phone with another CEO giving the hard lesson that I had learned to her. And so that is this validation of each of our lives. And it can happen for really big lessons, but it can happen for really small lessons. And so for me, the mission of Medium is to give everyone who's listening a place to come and share their lives because there's something validating about that. There's other people out there just like you who would benefit so much from the things that you've learned through the course of your career, through the course of your life.
Tony, it's so great that this big Medium user and writer, and then you have this journey and write about it just full circle. It's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing your story. Number one, in written form. Number two, coming on and talking about it. I know you're busy and our time is limited here. Thanks so much, man. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Well, we're two of a kind. And also thank you for having me, because I think like getting these lessons out is one of the most important things we can be doing.
Well, that's a wrap. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed it, do share it with your friends and on your social platforms. Big thanks to Sam Williams, my audio guy, and the beautiful bumper music you're hearing is Michael Petrovich's Bella Luna. For all my show notes or resource links, visit larryweeks.com, and we will talk again soon.